Welcome to At One Insight World, where we dive deep into the forces shaping our world. Today, we're exploring Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall, a book that reveals how the physical landscape dictates the fate of nations. Published in 2015, this bestseller has become a must-read for anyone curious about geopolitics. Tim Marshall, a veteran British journalist with over 30 years of experience covering conflicts in places like Iraq, Syria, and the Balkans, breaks down complex global dynamics with clarity. In this audiobook summary, we'll focus on the Middle East, specifically Iran, Iraq, and Israel, to uncover how geography has trapped these nations in cycles of conflict and ambition. Let's get started. First, let's travel to Iran, a country often at the heart of global tensions, as we've seen in recent 2025 nuclear talks with the U.S. In Prisoners of Geography, Tim Marshall describes Iran as a natural fortress. To the west, the Zagros Mountains form a towering barrier, stretching over 1,500 miles, shielding Iran from invasions by neighbors like Iraq. To the north, the Elburz Mountains and the Caspian Sea create another defensive wall, while the Persian Gulf to the south offers access to global trade, but also exposes Iran to naval powers like the U.S. Marshall explains that this geography has made Iran a historically resilient nation, hard to conquer. But it's also isolated Iran, fueling its sense of paranoia and self-reliance. The Zagros Mountains, for instance, have protected Iran from the chaos of Mesopotamia, but they've also limited Iran's ability to expand westward, pushing its ambitions eastward towards Central Asia or southward in the Gulf. This isolation has shaped Iran's modern strategies. Marshall points out that Iran's geography forces it to focus on controlling the Persian Gulf, especially the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow choke point through which 20% of the world's oil passes. Iran knows that dominating the strait gives it leverage over global energy markets, which is why tensions with the U.S. and its allies, like Saudi Arabia, are so high. We've seen this play out in 2025 with Iran's threats to close the strait during nuclear negotiations. But geography also limits Iran's options. The flat deserts on its eastern border with Afghanistan make it vulnerable to smuggling and instability, while its mountainous northwest, home to Kurdish minorities, is a constant source of internal tension. Marshall argues that Iran's leaders, from the Shah to the Ayatollahs, have always been prisoners of this geography, forced to balance defense, influence, and internal control, all while surrounded by rivals. Now, let's move west to Iraq, a country whose geography, in Marshall's words, makes it a geopolitical tragedy. Iraq sits in the heart of the Fertile Crescent, a region blessed with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which gave birth to some of the world's earliest civilizations, like Mesopotamia. But this blessing is also a curse. The rivers make Iraq's land fertile and desirable, but the flat plains offer no natural defenses. Marshall explains that unlike Iran, with its protective mountains, Iraq has been a crossroads for invaders throughout history. Persians, Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, Ottomans, and more recently, the U.S. in 2003. The lack of natural barriers means Iraq is constantly vulnerable, a battleground for empires and ideologies. The rivers also create internal divisions. Marshall notes that the Tigris and Euphrates divide Iraq into distinct regions: the Sunni heartland in the west, the Shiite south, and the Kurdish north. These divisions, rooted in geography, have fueled Iraq's sectarian conflicts, which we still see in 2025 with ongoing tensions between Baghdad and the Kurdish regional government. The rivers also make Iraq dependent on upstream neighbors like Turkey, which controls the flow of the Euphrates through dams like the Ataturk Dam. Marshall highlights how Turkey's ability to turn off the tap gives it immense power over Iraq's agriculture and economy, a power dynamic that's only grown more tense with climate change reducing water levels in the region. Iraq's geography, Marshall argues, traps it in a cycle of vulnerability, division, and dependence, making stability a near-impossible dream. Finally, let's turn to Israel, a tiny nation whose geography has defined its entire existence. Marshall describes Israel as a geopolitical anomaly, a small strip of land, just 9 miles wide at its narrowest point, surrounded by hostile neighbors. To the west, Israel has the Mediterranean Sea, which gives it access to trade and allies like the U.S., but also makes it a target for naval blockades. To the east, the Jordan River and the West Bank create a buffer, but also a source of conflict with Palestinians. To the north, the Golan Heights, which Israel captured from Syria in 1967, provide a strategic vantage point, but also a front line with enemies like Hezbollah in Lebanon. Marshall explains that Israel's lack of geographic depth, no mountains, no vast deserts, means it has almost no room for error in defending itself. An enemy tank could cross the country in a day. This vulnerability has shaped Israel's military strategy, which we've seen in action with its 2025 preparations to strike Iran's nuclear sites, as discussed in our recent video. Marshall points out that Israel's geography forces it to rely on preemptive strikes and a strong air force, because it can't afford to fight a prolonged war on its own soil. The Golan Heights, for instance, are non-negotiable for Israel, not just for water from the Sea of Galilee, but because they offer a high ground to monitor threats from Syria and Lebanon. But this geography also isolates Israel, making it dependent on external allies like the U.S. for weapons and diplomatic support. Marshall argues that Israel's leaders are prisoners of this geography, constantly balancing survival, expansion, and the need for peace, all while surrounded by threats. What can we learn from these stories? In Prisoners of Geography, Tim Marshall shows us that the Middle East conflicts aren't just about politics or religion. They're deeply rooted in the land itself. Iran's mountains make it a fortress, but also a loner. Iraq's rivers make it fertile, but also a target. Israel's small size makes it agile, but also paranoid. Geography doesn't just shape borders, it shapes destinies. Thanks for listening to this audiobook summary on At One Insight World. If you found this insightful, check out Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall for the full story. It's a game changer for understanding our world. What do you think? How does geography shape the Middle East today? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more geopolitics content. Until next time, stay curious,